Starting my speech in 3, 2, 1. Panel, 2 fundamental problems with that speech I want to observe before I begin my speech. First one is, note that that speech is entirely catastrophic, right? We argue that the scale of which the speaker wants to argue about women dying within schools was quite low. That is to say that schools are very much a safe place because they have high liability. A lot of these schools were businesses. That is to say that if they had a lot of people dying within those schools, people weren't going to go to those schools in the first place. It was going to get bad rap. So from the very instance of this, note that this team wanted to catastrophize the entire debate. They never actually wanted to engage with where this debate actually took place. The other thing the second observation to make, is this team does not engage in this debate in the developing world, right? Because single-sex education was very gender-specific in the developing world. Places like India, places like Bangladesh, places like Pakistan were very, had less funding for single-sex, girls' schools than they had for boys' schools. This was things that were structurally true, and this was things that this team needed to deal with. Don't let this team get away with, 1, catastrophizing the entire argument, and 2, forgetting about where this debate actually takes place, which was in the developing world. 3 things then in the speech. Firstly, on setup. Secondly, on why we better set up girls for after school. And then finally, on safety. Okay, firstly then on setup. So what are the interests of girls? We think that we broadly agree with that speaker as to what the interests were, but we think 2 extensions here. The first extension is we think they want access to diverse opportunities. That is to say that they want to be able to engage with their male peers. They want to be able to engage with people that they had to engage with for the rest of their fucking life, right? We think that this was intuitively true because the only way you could set them up and the only way that they could actually become better in interacting with the occasions that the speaker wants to talk about was by putting them in that environment, right? And we think this was something that was just important to them. But the second thing, and we think the far more important thing that girls cared about was setting up for afterlife, right? We think that this was where this debate really takes place, is to which side better sets a girl up for after she completes school. Because in their world, they doom that girl not to get the best opportunities that they could. Second question then is, what is the purpose of schools? We think, like I told you before, the purpose of school is to prepare you for life after school. We think this looks like 2 things. The first one is academia. That is to say that it gives you a pathway into tertiary education, college, university, so then you can get to an ultimate job. But secondly, and we think this is also very important, it wants to make you a well-rounded person that has diverse experiences, that has the ability to interact with all types of people, not just one sex, right? We think that this was also the purpose of school. Okay, final question then in setup. What do these schools look like? I think this team wanted to tell you about, this team heavily asserts to you that subjects were the same, and this is because this was going to be controversial. Note that even in the Western worlds, girls' schools had home ec, like cooking classes, while in boys' schools they had engineering and cutting, shit like that, right? This was true in the Western world. Now, let's take it in the developing world, where it was very, very catastrophic, where women didn't have access to things like STEM subjects. Women were pushed into things like nursing, teaching, and being a housewife the best you possibly could be for your husband. These were the sort of ideologies that were pushed in single-sex schools in the developing world. This was something that they needed to do. The second observation was, because these developing worlds oftentimes thought that these men were the pillars of society, that got engineers and things like that, oftentimes they got more government funding, but also, note that because there was a higher population of men that were going into these schools, these private schools, there was much more funding within those. So we thought that these single-sex education schools for women had much less funding than what this team wants to talk about. Okay, first argument on why we better set up girls for after school. Notice that if we can prove this to you, we comprehensively win this debate because we think that this is where this debate really takes place on. Okay, and that's because we think that is the purpose of what school actually is, right? So first thing to observe, like I said in the setup, let's whip it again. We think that single-sex education around the world is heavily gender stereotypes. It pushes rigid gender roles, like women can do teaching, things like nursing, whereas men tend to do things like medicine, things like engineering. And this is structurally true because most of the engineers that ultimately went to university within places like India, within places like Bangladesh, and even in places like Australia, were most of the time men, right? And we think that this was very, very important to understand. The second thing is, this is the most catastrophic in the developing countries. Why was this true? Structural reasons as to why this was true. Firstly, the patriarchy was the worst in developing countries. That is to say that they believed that, like, in the developing countries, they believed that, like, women were, like, should be subservient to men. They had to, like, serve, like, this sort of role. What did that then mean for this debate? It meant that when you put this girl into a single-sex education, which was like girls' school, that meant one, they were going to get less resources. Two, there was going to be gender-specific subjects, which this team like, just asserts to you, saying that, oh, it's going to be controversial. Note that, like, it was unclear to us as to why these developing countries would care about why this would be controversial in a place where gender stereotypes was the fucking norm, right? So what did this mean? This meant, this ultimately, why was this harmful? We think this was harmful for three key respects. The first, and observed that there was a lack of opportunities. That is to say, these women that were put into these single-sex schools, like this opposition wants you to believe, they didn't have access to certain subjects, most notably subjects like STEM, most notably subjects like engineering, because this was perceived as something which was male-dominated. And we think what this meant is they didn't have the same level of opportunities which their male counterparts have. Now, the comparative on our side is, in a co-ed school, this team wants to tell you that this woman could, like, opt out of this, right? We think it's much better comparatively in weighing it up that this woman had the ability to be able to do that subject in the first place than not be able to do that subject, right? We think we put the choice back onto the woman to be able to access those sort of subjects, access STEM subjects, access engineering subjects, which wasn't something which was prevalent. Okay, secondly then, the second reason why this was harmful was because it pushed them into, like, rigid gender stereotypes. This meant that it told them, like, what they could do. What does it mean to be like a woman? What did it mean? Why was this exclusive? This is very important. We think that this was exclusive under their side of the house because because in a co-ed school, you had to use much more neutral language. You had to use, like, this is what it means to be a person, right? It was less gender specific because you're trying to cater to the whole group of people. Whereas in a single-sex girls' school, you were very much like catering to that. Okay, secondly, on where this team wants you to believe this debate takes place on, which is safety. So what do they tell you? They tell you that young boys are sexist. Like, we agree with this, sure. We agree broadly with their characterizations of what they say. But the problem with this argumentation, and the reason why this cannot win them the debate, is because the first speaker wants to, like I said at the start, categorize this argument at the nth degree, right? We told you that this is like where a woman died in a co-ed school. It's probably like a 1 or 2 case. Wasn't the vast majority of instances, right? And we also think this is because there was high liability within schools, even in the developing world, because these schools were going to have a lot of surveillance, were going to have all of that. So at the end of this speech, because we were the only team that could set women up for after school, give them all the opportunities which this team couldn't do, we're very proud to oppose.
Thank the first negative speaker for that fine speech. Now I'm inviting the second affirmative speaker.
This team hinges their benefits on the idea that this takes place all in the developing world. But that, I think, is actually really bad for them, because as they identified, patriarchy and sexism is far worse in these places, so all of our impacts about things like harassment, things like violence, which are far more prevalent in the developing world, things like violence against women is extraordinarily prevalent in places in India, that kind of thing is really bad and happens far more on their side. It notably happens to every woman who goes to this school probably, and that's extraordinarily harmful. Their claim here is that they get STEM subjects and things like that. We preemptively explain to you that women are not able to opt into these subjects in co-ed schools, that they're pressured and harassed out of them. So at the very least, that applies to a far smaller group of people on their side. You should weigh both the larger size impact, the fact that you have experienced violence, you experience harassment, you get pushed into gender roles, and the fact that it is a far greater group of people over anything that this team tries to tell you. Firstly, on the scale of these kinds of harms, and then talking about the developing world and how it impacts there, and about academics and things like like that. Firstly, in terms of the scale of this, they say the scale just isn't that high, and it's not always there. I would say that lower levels, things like harassment, are still catastrophic, are extraordinarily bad, and are harmful to all of the women who experience them, and it should be stopped. And it is something that is stopped on our side, because you do not have to spend every day of your life from when you are in year 7 to when you are in year 12 around men who harass you, men who have assaulted you in the past. Even if men get better, even if they get punished, you are still forced to be around the person who attacked you. You're forced to be around the person who did something so bad to you. And that, I would say, is harmful. But even if you believe that it is not that catastrophic, it is still extraordinarily harmful. Things like slut shaming are still extraordinarily bad to the people with whom it occurs. Things like body shaming are things that are harmful. Those things occur on their side, they simply occur far less on our side by nature of the fact that you are just not around women as much. As I said in my introduction, especially in the cases where they want to frame this debate, places like the developing world, where there is increased things like patriarchy, increased gender norms, mean that you're far more likely to see this. And then the way they stop this is there's like liability from the school, and they have like a reputation to uphold. In the places where they identify that patriarchy is so severe, things like sexism, things like sexual violence are not cared about as much. They are not things that hinge the reputation of a school on. They are not things the people who are like the principal in the school care about as much. They're far more, they're like unwilling to believe the things that women are telling them and the claims of sexism that exist. This is because, as we identify, they're far more likely to have men in power. Men who do not believe in things like sexism and things like harassment, who are themselves part of the problem, particularly from older generations who have yet to undergo any social change and often are like stuck in their old ways, and as such are likely to see the sexism go unpunished. We preemptively explain to you why things like reputation, things like punishment and stuff are not able to overcome the existence of sexism in these societies. But even then, you still get the sexism in those early years, which is something that is extraordinarily harmful. So they can't just avoid this by saying that you get better and like there's like policing and that stops that. Now then, let's talk about the developing world, given that we've explained that sexism is something that is likely to impact people and it is going to impact them to a severe extent. They say, firstly, on the developing world, there is less funding for single-sex schools, and so that is particularly harmful. Two responses. The first one is to say they hint the alternative here as being co-ed schools, but often the alternative to these single-sex schools is just no school. In places where it is so patriarchal, things like access to education are extraordinarily limited. And the reason single-sex schools exist is because they're funded by things like religious institutions or charities, or it is for the reason we explain, things like safety. In Afghanistan, the reason why you had to have schools that were funded by charities that only were for women is because if they were sent to a school that wasn't just for women, they would experience things like sexual violence. They would be harassed by the male staff, they would be harassed by men outside. And that kind of thing is why our side is so important, because it actually provides people access to a school in the first place, in places where it otherwise wouldn't exist or would be extraordinarily damaging. Secondly, sexism is, as I said, far worse in these places and far worse here. This extends all of our impacts, outweighing the things that they describe, both on severity and on the size of the group that we are impacting directly. That explains why this claim that there is less funding for single-sex schools on our side is not something that meaningfully matters. So even if you believe that there is less funding on our side, we still win this debate. Because I would rather send a woman, like the woman, I guess, the interest of the woman, is to go to a slightly less funded school than it is to go to one where they experience things like violence, where they experience things like harassment. That is a massive impact to this woman. It impacts them for the rest of their life. It puts them in a place where they had that kind of childhood trauma, and as I'll go into, it builds them into those gender norms far more than going to a single-sex school ever could. And that kind of thing is an extending impact that impacts them for their whole life, and that is far worse. Now then, let's talk about subject selection. They say that women single-sex female schools don't have things like STEM subjects. Three responses. First one is to say that in places that they describe where sexism is so high that a single-sex school wouldn't offer these STEM subjects, it's likely there are still restrictions placed on women within co-ed schools as to whether or not they can meaningfully access these subjects. And that is likely to exist. In places where there is extraordinarily religious culture that stops women from accessing education in the first place, it is unclear to me why they would allow women to access things like STEM subjects in the first place. Or at the very least, they wouldn't place so much pressure on these women that the vast majority of them do not access the impact that they describe, and instead are still pushed in the same subjects that this team claims would exist on our side. Secondly, we explained to you, and we further extending on it, is that there's a massive amount of social pressure placed on these women to not access these subjects. This team assumes that there is free access to these subjects just because they exist. There's a burden that is missing here, and that is that women are free to access these. We explained to you that in places where there is sexism, which, as we identify, is everywhere, you're likely to see harassment. Even in the developing world, places that are particularly liberal, there is massive amount of harassment in things like STEM. They push women out of those subjects. They tell them that it's not where they're meant to be. And that kind of thing is super harmful to them. It means they're less likely to access these subjects. On our side, in the comparative, you are by yourself, you're only with women who do not face that kind of pressure, do not face that pressure from women. Things like gender roles, as we explained, are exacerbated when you're trying to play it up for men. You're trying to fit into those gender roles so you can appease the men around you and have their competitive interest about the men and appeasing those men. But that doesn't exist on our side. We don't have men that you're you're trying to appease on our side, which means you're more likely to access things that are outside of traditional gender roles and gender norms, which means you're more likely to go to STEM subjects. This is, I would again identify just empirical truth. STEM subjects are far more common on our side in places where you have single-sex schools. The final thing is to say why these subjects would exist on our side. And that's because there's massive amount of pressure from parents and kids. Parents themselves want what is best for their kids. They want their kids to access things like subjects. We explain something that is upstream of that. It's not about whether or not the subject is accessed in the fact that the school provides it, which we say is likely to be symmetric, but it's about whether the kid is willing to access it. And we explain that on their side, kids are not willing to access these subjects. Because accessing that subject comes with things like harassment, comes with assault, and that kind of thing is extraordinarily harmful to them, and it's bad that it occurs, and it occurs more on their side. Now then, let's talk about women interacting with men, which is another claim they allude to in their speech. This is, I think, unclear. So two things. Firstly, this is just what we tell you, which is about fitting into gender norms. And it's what they try to claim is a benefit on their side. It looks like women being quieter in the classroom, not speaking up, because they know that that is the kind of thing that would maybe put them more in danger and like clash heads with men in the classroom. We avoid that, because we don't have the men in the classroom that take up space and take up noise and are more likely to speak up. We allow women to take up space, which increases their academic prospects far better than occurs on the other team's side. Secondly, obviously you can do this in other places and you can learn how to interact with men. You can have family, you can have friends, you can do it at university later in your life. What we say is important that it occurs later rather than earlier. So we explain that when you do it later, you're far more likely to no longer not be like pushed into those gender roles in your most formative years, which is when you're in high school, and instead you do it later, when you're more an independent person and you have more strength in those kinds of relationships. But notably on our side, it is opt-in. You opt in to have male friends. And that kind of thing means you're less likely to have male friends who are willing to harass you and who do assault you. On their side, it's not just people who you opt into, it's the people you're forced to be around at the school. And that means you're more likely to have them be sexist because you can't escape, you can't leave, because you're stuck in the classroom with them, and that is particularly harmful. Now I'm going to extend and finish the argument about why it is bad to instrumentalize women to get men to be better, which is kind of this claim that they're making, that women like teach men in some way to interact with them better. The problem here is this is principally bad because you're instrumentalizing girls in a way that harms them directly. It causes them to experience sexism so they can please them, placing a double burden of both being the victim and the fixer of sexism itself. But furthermore, we explain it doesn't work and is actively harmful. We explain that opt-in is far better, creates a competitive interest around men elsewhere to act better so that women are willing to hang out with them. But furthermore, we explain it doesn't work on their side. Men aren't receptive to this because they're being forced into it. We say that the policing doesn't work because it's unlikely to be successful. And thirdly, that these aren't the men you experience later in life, so it's not a benefit to like socialize them. For those reasons, proud to affirm.
Okay. It's true that girls want to engage with boys. It's also true that girls want to be set up for a successful adult life. But the key word and the caveat that side negative misses is they want to do all of those things safely. They want to do all those things without the risk of physical violence. They want to do those things without the risk of harassment, which is endemic in the status quo. I'll begin by explaining why we guarantee female safety, why that's the most important benefit in the round. Then I'll explain why co-ed schooling isn't necessary to socialize men and teach them not to be sexist. And finally, I'll explain why in the developing world, the alternative is fewer opportunities for girls, and why in the developed world, the answer is better opportunities on our side. Firstly, on safety. We only hear two responses from side negative. The first is just that we have exaggerated the problem, as if teen suicide rates are not at all-time highs, as if gender polarization, toxic masculinity, misogyny spewed by people like Andrew Tate isn't at all-time highs. You don't have to believe that the worst case happens all the time is teen suicides, which certainly do happen, but you have to believe all the other kinds of things are prevalent. Things like harassment, things like name-calling, things like wolf whistling, things like slut-shaming. These are endemic. This team is tone deaf to the problem. The second, slightly better response is to say that schools have sufficient liability. There are four problems with this argument. First, it assumes that girls report these misconduct in the first place. But we point out the same pressures that coerce girls, they bully them, are the same things that make them very afraid to report a male peer, are the very things that gaslight girls into thinking, was that an example of someone being sexist towards me, or someone being particularly mean to me for a general reason? That is why girls are too afraid to report in the first instance. Second of all, they assume that it's easy to litigate. But think about it. It's very difficult for the police to prosecute sexual assault and rape. Imagine how much harder it is to prosecute things like wolf whistling, name calling, things that are more susceptible to problems of he said, she said testimony, that are more susceptible to problems of plausible deniability. That's why it's actually very difficult to litigate in the first place. Thirdly, and this is crucial, they assume that the direction of liability is predominantly towards the female victim. But we explain that it's often opposite in a series of instances. Firstly, in instances of public schools, like the overriding duty of the care is for the government to provide the child with the education that they are mandated. So yes, they can be suspended, yes, they can be expelled, but they still have to go to school, they need to be taken somewhere, and that school that they are sent to is the breeding ground for them to hunt and bully their female victims. Second of all, even if we are talking about private schools, which the negative team seems to be talking about, the problem is that one, the parents of the alleged perpetrator are also very willing to countersue their school if they expel their child for being sexist. They will countersue, or they'll pull their donations because they're a very wealthy alumni, and that means the school is not likely to take action against their child. Or second of all, why would a for-profit school admit to a problem of crippling internal sexism? Why would they do that? That would damage their reputation. That would be against their profit incentives, which is why their more likely incentive is to cover it up or to explain it away for other reasons. To say, well, the girl committed suicide not because she was bullied as a result of sexist male peers, but because she had a mental health problem, for instance, which is why often the liability goes the inverse fashion. What is the upshot of this? It means that 90% of sexual harassment goes under the radar for side negative because it isn't harmful enough or easy to prosecute in a legal sense, but it definitely hurts people in the day-to-day. It hurts people to have their body image questioned, to be harassed, to be shoved behind the back when they're walking down the school hallway. Those things accumulate, those things hurt people, they have irreversible damage to people's lives, but they can't be prosecuted by a court that is deeply imperfect. Second of all, at best, their litigation benefit is quite speculative, but the process itself is enormously harmful. You have to relive your trauma. You have to go through 6 months of protracted legal battle. We think many people are unlikely to do that, and even if they are likely to do that, it is certainly taxing. So they are left with a very, very weak mitigation to our argument. Why is safety easily the most important benefit in the round? For 4 reasons. Firstly, often the harms are irreversible. You can't be a confident STEM student if you are sexually harassed. You're more likely to be traumatized. Secondly, it feeds into their benefit for the reason that you can't learn properly and meaningfully engage with the content if you fear that you're constantly afraid, if you feel insecure, if you feel harassed by your male peers. That's why our safety benefit is a precondition to their benefit of educated learning. Thirdly, it's far more unique, which is to say that we shield especially vulnerable teenage girls at a particularly vulnerable point of time, whereas their benefit that you can teach men to socialize can occur in other arenas, so their thing is far more mutually inexclusive than our thing, which is unique. So that is why our argument is already the most important we have already won this debate. I'll now move on to the second question. Why co-ed schooling isn't necessary to socialize men. We hear 2 arguments from second negative. The worst one is that this is necessary to make women aware of the risks of sexism. I think women are sufficiently aware of the risks of sexism because they hear about it in their day-to-day lives. You don't need to expose someone to the risk for women to be aware that that risk is credible. The second problem with this is that, no, we don't want women to think that sexism is normal. We want them to think it is abnormal. We do not want them to expect the idea that they will be sexually harassed. We want them to expect that is an unacceptable behavioral practice. And that normalization that second negative says is a benefit is in fact a harm. It makes people more likely to tolerate sexism in the workplace instead of calling it out, instead of asserting their rights as a human being. That is why that is an incredibly bad argument. The slightly better argument is that, well, you need girls and boys to mingle in order to make men less sexist, and that over time is a benefit towards women. There are a couple of problems with this. The first is that we explained that this isn't about minimizing the total number of interactions, well, to some extent it is, but it's about changing the arena in which teenage girls interact with teenage boys in a way that gives teenage girls more agency. So, why is gender interaction and commingling still likely to happen in other ways, but better in our world? Two ways. Firstly, you still get social interaction outside of school. So for example, teenagers hanging out at the mall. Why is that far better for girls? Well, it's better for them because girls can choose to opt in and out of those social interactions. You can choose the time and place, you can choose who to hang out with. That's not true of school because most kids don't choose who their classmates are and they can't leave the classroom when they're being harassed without crippling their education. The reason why that's still a useful benefit to socialize boys is boys have to learn to behave better if they want to continue to have a social relationship with their female peers, which is why you still get that benefit of socializing men without subjugating girls to experiences where they're unable to opt out. That's why you still get it in our world. But lastly, you still get social interaction in adult place and workplace. And the negative team's logic is silly. It assumes there's like a finite period of time where people are able to learn how to, get along with one another. No, that can occur at any point. It's unclear why that can't happen in the adult workplace where people are more likely to be mature, where they're likely to be out of the spurs of puberty and things like that, which is often why teenage men are most likely to be misogynistic in their adolescent years because they're most likely to be insecure about their body, they're most prone to social media narratives and things like that. Like, to use a simple analogy to illustrate how absurd the negative team's logic is, their logic would be like, well, since people will have to learn how to drive a car for the vast majority of their adult life, that's why we need to subject every 13-year-old to driving lessons behind the wheel. Obviously not, because they don't have the sufficient level of maturity maturity for those lessons to be meaningful. That is precisely our argument. Teenage boys aren't sufficiently mature enough to learn how to grow up alongside female peers, which is why they need to be isolated temporarily until they get to the point where they are mature enough in order to interact with their peers. That is why co-ed schooling isn't necessarily a socializing event, and the vast majority of benefit walks away from this debate. Finally, on whether there are better opportunities for women in developing worlds. We point out that in the context where they want to set up the most sexist, the most misogynistic education systems, the alternative is not schools that are co-ed that have equal opportunities for men and girls. The alternative is no schooling for women. Like, all their logic implies that. If you believe that these systems concentrate their resources towards boys, which is why they don't fund single-sex schools, why would they let girls into a co-ed school? That would not be concentrating resources towards male peers, which is why this characterization in the scenario they set up is one where girls do not have a meaningful alternative. They then say, well, single-sex schools in your world offer fewer subjects. But in both teams' best case, this is a symmetric argument, because just because a subject is being afforded does not mean the subject is in fact taken. In their best case, these girls do not take up those subjects because they are bullied out of it effectively, which means that it doesn't matter whether the school option is offered or not. They say it's useful to have the option, but we point out that in contexts where that option exists, well, it's very likely that we're not talking about the worst case of sexism countries. Obviously, for example, things like progressive parents don't just send their kids to single-sex schools, they also send their kids to single-sex schools. For those reasons, we're very proud to do
Thank you, affirmative speaker, for that speech. Now moving on to the third negative speaker.
What this affirmative team cannot do is protect girls after they leave school. They're saying, oh, if we just shut boys off the portion of their adolescent years, then they'll magically be good human beings and will treat girls well and girls will be safe in the future. They say that, we're just trying to normalize this sexism in school. No, we're not. We're trying to equip girls with the skills to be able to protect themselves and to feel confident and be able to manage their lives in a very sexist society. We live in a patriarchal world and we need to teach girls how to manage this rather than just ignoring the issue and letting them, they'll figure it out themselves once they leave school. So I'm going to do two main things in this speech, first on sexism and then the safety issue, and then also then on academic. Okay. So, we've had this weighed as the most high thing in this debate by this affirmative team. I think academic is also very important, but we'll get into that later. So what we've heard from them is that sexism is increasingly prevalent and has these drastic these drastic impacts. We think yes, sexism is increasingly prevalent, and we think that it is increasingly prevalent after people leave school. And I think this is the most important thing: is that the teaching of girls to deal with this needs to happen in school. They've said, it can happen at any point in their lives, they can deal with it in the workplace, they can deal with it later. I think what is really important to note is that it needs to happen in school, because school is the safest environment for girls to be able to manage this. At least in schools, there are some sense of support systems, right? If the teaching stuff is so terrible as the affirmative team wants to characterize, at least they have their other female peers. At least they have other male peers there as well who can support them in this. It is not just them on their own in the real world trying to deal with this. We think school is the most important time because they have the most support, and we think it is also really important that this happens early, when people are still developing, when they can learn these things. We think that is really important. And then they've also sort of just said, we're going to magically stop harassment, and there's no competition or insecurity. I think this element of competition is actually really important for academic outcomes is really important. So they're saying that men will just treat women terribly because they think girls are going to be better than them. We think it's far more important that this is normalized, that girls can be in this same competitive environment. We think this is better. We think they're going to learn how to deal with this competition, because we think this idea of voices being shut out, we think girls need to learn how to compete with men. They're saying that it's so toxic for the men to be competing with the women, but women are going to have to compete with men at every aspect and every stage of their lives. We think it's important that they learn how to do this in a healthy environment in school where they are still nurtured and supported, right? We think that is so important to do early on, because you don't just lose it afterwards. And yeah. So then they've also then just saying that you can just opt out of it after school and so like it's so much easier to do it like in after school hours. I think then the other thing is a lot of the violence is most likely to happen outside of school hours rather than just like within school, right? Like a lot of these like instances of like rape and harassment are happening at parties, are happening at things outside of school. So we think then, like, it is so much, there's not this opt-out system. Opt-out doesn't exist in a patriarchal world, right? We think that, like, you cannot just say that, oh, we just won't do it because, you know, girls can deal with that outside of school, girls can deal with that later. This socialization is, like, what they're arguing for is, like, socialization without support, right? They just want to, like, thrust girls out into like, oh, well, they can learn how to socialize outside of school hours when they don't have any support from staff, from services, from anything else like that. I think that is like a massive harm that they have on their part, is they're just saying, oh, in the most dangerous of circumstances, that is where women will learn to socialize with men, that is where men will learn to socialize with women, when they are most at risk, when they are so much likely to have like teachers or other members of the community watching over them, looking after them, supporting them. And then, so they've also then brought up this idea that, oh, well, like, schools just, like, won't admit to, like, anything that happens, and there's going to be no sense of reporting or anything of, like, instances of harassment, instances of violence. I think, well, like, what we can also note on this is that, like, it's so much worse for schools to have it come out. So we think like the Me Too movement has been massive, right? We think women are far more likely to report things because we see that happening across the world. We see that women get support internationally when they like, you know, portray this on social media. So we think even in developing countries, like women are speaking out on instances of violence and sexism. And we think that it's like so much worse when it's then found out that a school has been covering up instances of harassment, instances of abuse, instances of sexism. We think they're far more like incentivized to admit to it and then try to portray themselves as someone who is then going to like regulate and manage this rather than the school or institution that was just covering it up. So we do think that there is an incentive there for schools to admit to it at first instance so they can be on top of things and look like they are managing systems in that sense. So we think it is actually likely that we will get this sense of reporting in these like co-ed environments in these schools. Okay, so then I'm going to go on to, and I think, yeah, what we can note there is that like sexism is different from safety, right? So like, and they do exist together, but they do exist differently, right? And we think there is like so many mechanisms in our current world to support girls to be safe. And we think that that exists in things like, yes, in like the Me Too movement, in like a lot of this like media and questioning, but we think that like sexism is just going to be reinforced in same-sex, in like single-sex schools, right? Because you are like restricted to just this view of, okay, well girls and boys are different, that's why they should be in different schools. We're just further ingraining this message that we are different, that we should be treated different, that guys can treat girls differently because they are different, because they don't even deserve to be in the same school as us because they're girls, they're doing other things, they're different. Okay, so then on to like academics, because I think that the affirmative team have tried to just like weigh this out of the debate by saying you don't get academics without safety, but I think we can prove that you still get safety in any school system because there is that incentive and it is like still a support system, it is still a school. I think it is really important that we like weigh academics really highly because that is like one of the main outcomes of school, right? You only get to be like this good developed human being if you have like these good, well, like you get the best out of your schooling if you have these like best academic outcomes, right? And so the main argument that they've pushed on this is that, oh, like girls won't self-select out of things. But I think the main thing that we're like trying to push is that it's so much better, like in the instances that maybe girls do self-select, rather than schools selecting for them, right? Because we think that's the alternative. It's either girls get to choose whether they do or don't want to get STEM subjects, or whatever subjects it is, or schools do choose for them. And we think it's ridiculous for them to just say, oh, well, you know, like, there's like this market like incentive for schools to offer like the same subjects because we see that doesn't exist. We see like in Western countries and in developing countries that this just frankly isn't the case. We see that in countries like, you know, in countries like Australia that like all girls schools are offered different subjects to men. They are offered things like home ec, whereas men are offered, you know, manual labour and they're offered engineering that just aren't offered at girls' schools. So we think like this just deeply like, it like creates this like massive imbalance, right? Where like men are far more likely to have these bad academic outcomes than girls are. And like we think that it is so much more important that, you know, the accessibility is at least there. Even if you buy all like the affirmatives like stuff that, oh well, like girls will just like not choose, like not go into it because men are going to dominate the classroom. We think it is important that the opportunity is at least there. They're at least exposed to the subjects. The subjects are at least offered at their school. They at least have a choice. They're at least get to like see and have this access to it. Whereas the affirmative team just wants to push women out of like male-dominated fields. And we think it is so much like more important to like teach girls how to exist in a classroom, how to compete with these dominant male voices, rather than just leaving them like to deal with that for the rest of their lives. We need to teach them early on. We need to actually support women and actually do the best for them. So that's why we have to win today.
Thanks, Mr. Negative Speak for the speech. Now to conclude the next bench entirely, inviting the neg reply.
Starting my speech in 3, 2, 1. Panel, by the end of this debate, this affirmative team implicitly concedes that we get better education, that we set up girls better. Because at the end of this debate, note how like by the end of their third speech, all they tell you is, oh, it's symmetrical. Assert to you that it's just symmetrical. I will deal with why it wasn't. But also note that this meant that they hinged their entire case, the majority of their case, was on safety. So you believing that these harms were catastrophic to the nth degree that they wanted to tell you was contingent on you buying that no policing mechanisms existed at all, that women were absolutely like not safe at all in these schools, even though we tell you that they had support networks, even though we told you there were female teachers there, even though we tell you that it's probably not the environment where these sort of things actually take place, right? We tell you all those things which do not receive a single cent of response from this team. They simply needed to do a lot more to engage with the argumentation that we brought to you. Two things then in this reply. Firstly, on safety, and to explain to you why this team can't win this debate on this push. And then secondly, to tell you why we win this debate, on which side better sets up the woman for after school, which we think is where this debate really needs to take place. Firstly then, on safety. So what does this affirmative team tell you? They make the claim that sexism exists. This leads to like harassment, beatings, and death. Note that the first observation to make here is that the first speaker's speech made it seem like every woman that went to a co-ed school was dying, and then by third, it comes right back down to now being like, oh, it's like this sort of harassment or like things like bullying and things like that. So we think this is a big concession on this team because the harms that they wanted to tell you at first no longer stood by the time that they got to the third speaker. Note that it just didn't fly. Okay, the second observation and the responses that we need to hear was we pushed you from the very start, that we conceded from the very instance that there were certain instances where we told you that yes, these things would take place, this was uncontroversial. What we pushed to you was the scale at which these instances took place. This team heavily asserts to you throughout this debate that things like policing doesn't exist, things like liability doesn't exist, right? They tell you, the entire claim is that these fail in all instances, that schools wasn't a safe environment for these women at all. We think that this was highly uncharitable because this team just needed to do a lot more work in telling you this. Okay, then finally as to why the weighing of this. This team tells you that this is the most important issue in this debate. We believe that while safety is important, we think that the more important issue in this debate was actually about setting the woman up after life. The reason why is because this is what they were going to do for the rest of their life. This was the building blocks for the rest of their life, right? We think that the trade-off here is if you shield them for the first 18 years of their life, or the 17 years, but then you fuck them for the rest. We think that this was not a trade-off that we wanted to make. So even if you believe all their material, if we can prove to you that, and we can mitigate to you the safety, and we can prove to you that we set the woman up better for afterlife, we win. Okay, then what do we tell you, and what was our path to victory? We told you from the very get-go about education. We told you that there were certain messagings at the single-sex education schools which wouldn't exist in co-ed because it was more like neutral. We told you about funding, we told you about opportunities, we told you about accessibility. This was like clearly said throughout this bench. So what did this team tell you in response? They tell you by third that this was symmetrical because like patriarchy exists and things like that, right? They tell you that like women wouldn't go into these subjects and be bullied out. But the key thing here is we told you that they at least had the chance, had the accessibility, they had the autonomy to be able to choose these subjects, which on the comparative world, they did not, because those subjects, that funding just didn't exist in the first instance. This was a massive trade-off and a massive concession. So by the end of this debate, we believe we win because we set the woman up better for after school.
Start right with the call and then feedback and then the OA. So it was a unanimous vote for the team affirmative. I repeat, affirmative wins this debate. In terms of general feedback, so I think the first thing I want to just say here is that I think the debate, a huge part of the debate that we kind of thought was part of the motion, is the debate about the way that girls interact with other girls in these single-sex schools. And I think specifically for Team Affirmative, this is something that was really never discussed, or on Team Negative, something that you could have employed as a possible case to argue certain harms that happen. Because the, an underlying premise of the whole socialization thing, in terms of like the vacuum, does come down from the way that a lot of your interactions are with women. So a lot more nuanced mechanisms on how that kind of does lead to plausibly worse off impacts in your future could be another angle to debate, but generally I think both teams should be aware on that. It's still good to debate on safety. These are obviously relevant questions of the round, but I think this other thing is something that's important. The final thing I'll say in terms of general feedback is that I think it is good to explain why one issue weighs over the other, but in terms of explaining why you win an issue, it's not just enough to say, well, we avoid a harm and therefore that is enough, because I agree that that's one way to win an issue, but I think it's also important to explain there are mechanisms in our comparative that explain that the lives that they would live is far better. And we're not saying that teams don't do this, as there are claims that team forward to explain why their comparative would be better. It is just that a lot of the debate becomes about the negative stuff, the harms and the mitigating of the harms, and less about certain positive contributions on how how our world could meaningfully benefit women and stuff like that. All right, so two broad issues. Firstly, on safety and sexism. Secondly, on education. On safety and sexism, the first thing I'll just kind of ask in this contention is whether or not men in the vast majority of cases are going to be sexist and will they endanger women. I think this is where AF has a sort of clear win, and I think NEC doesn't really either trades this off or just doesn't really able to figure out a strong response to it. A lot of the A1 speech structurally proves a lot of reasons why boys in teenage years are likely to be faced under immature behavior, are likely to be influenced by patriarchal norms, and there are just empirical trends happening that the average youth voter would obviously know as well, to just lead to the conclusion that men in generally to not only turn to sexism, but also use that sexism as a form of exerting microaggressions towards other. And I think there's a unique harm that AF explains. This directly applies to school, where the most vulnerable and immature kids are going to be. Next, only response to this that I think we can credit reasonably is that, well, guys, it's not that deep. It's obviously going to be men are not going to be that bad. There are a few problems with this response. The first is that even though the gut check is intuitively correct, it doesn't actually deal with the huge chunk of analysis that Affirmative explains on specifically the ways that boys would want to get away through microaggressions. So just because stabbings and beatings won't happen, bullying, slut-shaming, and all these things are still things that Affirmative prove to be true, prove that men have the capacity to do, and that's something important. On the second note, I think Negative just doesn't explain on mitigatory response to why men wouldn't act this way or why boys wouldn't act this way. And I think there were potential avenues to try and at least mitigate the behavior of boys in the school, maybe to try and say that they're not socialized to be that bad, at least try to mitigate the extent of patriarchy influencing this. But the conclusion of this leads me to believe that even if I believe some examples of Affirmative are extreme, it's a spectrum of harms that still occur that Negative does not address the root of, given that the frame of AF is that in these schools, men are unavoidable and you have to interact with them. I think you ought to prioritize a lot of the impacts that happen. More importantly though, does accountability and policing happen? I think this is obviously far more important, because if Affirmative proves accountability doesn't happen, then the huge extent of the harms that occur from the first part of the OA I explained would manifest in the worst ways possible. Affirmative's reasons as to why accountability just doesn't happen is first to explain that girls are scared to report for a variety of reasons. They're socialized to feel scared to report. They're not really aware. There's some extent of cognitive dissonance. The second is just the fact that the mechanisms of accountability are tended to be corrupted against women. So for example, there tends to be systems of wanting to favoritism to prioritize the school, to prioritize the reputation of the school. And the third claim they make here is that detention and deterrence is often not enough, because firstly, it only mitigates some behavior, but even if it does, the extent of harm that does occur, the harm has happened, it is irreversible, and you still face the harm. Next response to this is to explain that schools generally have some incentive and mechanism to ensure that the accountability is not that corrupted. So they explain things like, well, schools might risk the fear of losing funding, they might fear the fact that they get a lot of backlash. I think they hint at some ways of how is it that external mechanisms can reinforce accountability. The problem is that the extent of which this beats the harms on affirmative is not enough for a few reasons. The first is just the fact that affirmative reasons are rooted in the psychological reasons of why women don't want to do this in the first place, which is often the first prerequisite to even getting any form of accountability. So that engages in one win condition, and affirmative is able to suggest on accountability. The second is that all the affirmative reasons on the mechanisms to how is it is hard for women to get accountability on their own prove to me that even if you can go to the extent of reporting to the principal, it's unclear why A, the outcomes of reporting to the principal will be in your favor, B, even if you do report and it is in your favor, the fact that the harm can exist. This proves to me that the level of agency that women have over their own safety in terms of the fact that they lack control, the fact that they cannot report, suggests to me that accountability is far more likely to be worse off, therefore I'm far more likely to believe affirmative's impacts. I'm going to, now in terms of that's the physical stuff, I want to talk about socialization because this is rooted heavily in sexism. This is where a lot of next material comes into play, where the main root of the claim is that, well, you need to be able to have men and women interact with each other in these schools to form the basis of protecting yourself against these things. I think affirmative is able to deal with this with a few ways. The first is on just saying that the pre-existing gender roles in the school means that women are likely to be pressured. So they give illustrations such men dominating the classroom, women don't feel safe in speaking up and interacting within the classroom, which mitigates their ability to just feel safe. Even if some extent of socialization hinted at in the negative later speeches, they can happen, i.e. women can be friends with men, etc. I think these claims were not really completed enough to explain to us what the extent of socialization is something that is a guaranteed benefit on the side of negative. But the second thing I'll just point out here is that I think affirmative do deal with this claim directly by saying that firstly, girls generally already know the risk, and I think the burden on the side of negative was to explain why girls needed to be exposed to this risk as opposed to on the comparative probably some extent. I agree that there's some valuable material in the negative of the harms of shielding the girls away from the dangers in terms of how they explain this could affect future outcomes. But the issue with this claim is just that even if it is true that I ought to care about the future outcomes by not shielding the men, this is again, number one, still the prerequisite to fulfilling that burden is explaining they have a generally okay experience in mixed school, which I think affirmative, even if you don't believe that they win on the extreme cases, they do explain that because of the predominant patriarchy, it is not necessarily a good experience. So the long-term benefit seems slightly speculative. So even if there's a harm on shielding them in the now, which I can credit to some extent, it's not clear why it is the tipping point for me to believe that women's better, given that I've already weighed safety to be far more higher in terms of not like in terms of like, them being tangibly harmed right now. The fact that this happens short term, it's very much clear that the negative benefit is not something, or at least the negative avoidance of that harm is not something that I prioritize to be important. I think obviously the safety clash ought to be more way over just before I get into academics. Firstly, because of the fact that it's well proven that women are the more vulnerable stakeholder in this round. Second, it's proven that it is the more prerequisite clash to academia in the first place. So I would just say at this point in the round, would already have clear in because they do a lot of weighing work. But still, let's talk about academia because I think this is a huge part of the debate that still matters as well. First, I want to settle the funding stuff. So I think there's a bit of a disagreement on the comparative. So Af says on Neg World, but these mixed schools don't get funding because they are patriarchal societies. And next case, no, actually the single gender schools don't get funding because it's a patriarchal society. I think the resolution to this is a slight bit unclear because it's unclear why, because both of these are like competing reasons to why a school would not want to for one school over the other. But I think what the conclusion we got out of this is that in the vast majority of developing states, excluding exceptional examples like Afghanistan, NEC does have a fair point to point out that in mixed schools generally do exist, and I don't think affirmative gives claims to explain why women cannot opt into mixed schools on the NEC world. I think they mostly just say like it is such a patriarchal society, so they don't feel safe going in, but not necessarily that it isn't there. So some metrics that NEC explain of the accessibility of certain schools and subjects, we can see some light to that. And I think the idea of the final thing I just want to say is that there is some extent of provability on the idea of single-sex schools being funded less. I think whilst these were claims that could be forwarded far more, I think Affirmative does deal with this in a few ways. I think the first thing they explain is that it would be slightly controversial to have asymmetric like subjects. I agree that there is less priority because it is a single-sex school, but I think the other thing they point out here is that firstly, there are some extent of funding that occurs from external actors. I think Negative only dismisses this response, but it doesn't really explain to me why single-sex schools don't exist in the majority of cases. And I think the setup from first does kind of point to the direction of the debate where it should be. I think Neg needed to directly contend and explain far more reasons to explain why in the majority of cases single-sex schools are likely not to exist. But I also think that Affirmative does be able to weigh this off when they explain that, look, in the worst case, we're happy to concede less funded schools if it means we win on the clash on safety, etc., and things like that. So I think on the question of schools being funded, there's some legwork to believe Negative's claims here, but I think the extent of which this kind of has an evaluation and debate is not that deep. Now on actual academic outcomes, NEC makes an important claim here to say that the kinds of subjects that you're constrained to when you're in single-sex schools is likely limited, and when you are at least in schools, you get accessibility because you get STEM. I think AF deals with this in a few ways, and this is just outside of the safety thing. I think the first thing they explain is that the general rules means that you're often constrained within the kinds of subjects that you're actually forced to take. So they make the claim that, well, if you do take STEM, there are often many ways that you get pressured out of it, or you feel a bit unsafe, or you don't feel that fulfilled because of the fact that you don't do this. I don't think NEC really deals with this claim. I think they try to say that we want to weigh this high because we give them the accessibility of these subjects. The problem is that I'm not clear why the accessibility matters more than the experience of facing these subjects. So even NEC does have the exclusive benefit of more subjects. I think it's not really clear to why they win on this. But the second is just that a lot of the affirmative setup does kind of preempt this already. So the margin of how many different subjects exist in this is not very that limited. Maybe the girls' school just happens to have a home economics class, but they still have math, science, and all that other jazz. So for me, it's not really clear on why there's a substantial difference. I agree that the funding thing does play a part in the limited scope of the subjects that can be taken. But I think affirmative does, again, weigh this out, like not just within the first thing I said about weighing this off for safety, but just on the second level, which is just unclear why is it that the educational outcome of a less funded school, especially when other metrics are secure, like the experience of safety you have, the interaction you have with girls that make you feel a little bit more safer, you interact with peers and other teachers who are going to prioritize your safety. I think all of these do prove to me that the educational outcome, maybe it doesn't guarantee success in the future, but no team really proves to me like in the long term that all these girls would graduate. So the debate becomes more about the short-term experience of academia and how they're likely to live life there. I think in that ground, affirmative does prove to me that the experience is slightly better. So for all of those reasons, I gave AF the win. Thank you everyone for the OA. You can just approach me for feedback.